We like to welcome you to the first public speaker program for 2015. It's part of our public speaker series that we take pride in carrying on every year, keeping up the 90-year tradition of the Council, hosting distinguished speakers from Washington, from several think tanks, hosting ambassadors and dignitaries. And we've had great sessions in the fall of last year, and we're very happy to host this very timely event speaking about Cuba with the turnaround in the political atmosphere with Cuba after the administration latest moves. Can't be any more timelier. We encourage you to attend our speakers programs. You have a brochure with upcoming events. On March 10th, we're hosting Ambassador Mark Grossman speaking on what's next in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Our other main function, is running the Model UN program in the city. I'm sure some of you probably went through the program yourselves or your children. It's been very successful and important program in education on international issues for our area. And this year, we touched 1,200 students in many schools throughout the region. They compete, and it's been a very successful program. And this coming March, we're celebrating the 70th year of this program in the city. And we're looking for alumni. Any of you went through the program, or your children, maybe contact Yenny in the back. We're looking for alumni, and we hope to have some exciting events. Our other program is hosting International Visitors Program, which is a program sponsored by the Department of State. The Department of State invites delegations from all over the world to come to the United States from all kinds of professions, and they connect with their counterpart, and Cleveland has been a flagship for the program. This last year, we hosted 250 professionals in different areas, from administrators, parliamentarians, healthcare providers, professors, academia, entrepreneurs. And we connect them with their counterpart organizations, but we also connect them with families in the region to spend an evening with them and have an exchange of cultural issues and share best practices in their areas. It's been very positive and very rewarding experience, and we encourage you to take part of that excitement, hosting international guests in your homes. If you have any interest, please contact Ryan in the back on your way out. Today, I would like also to pay a special thanks to the Cleveland Foundation. As you know, the Cleveland Foundation, presented by its leader here, Mr. Ron Richards, has been the engine behind the latest growth in Cleveland and the turnaround that you see around you in the city. And they've been very supportive of the council, and they were the presenting sponsor of our second Global Impact Award dinner last October. The speaker was Mr. Strobe Talbot, the president of the Brookings Institution. Mr. Ted Piccone today is a leader in the Brookings Institution as well. Thank you, Ron, for all you do to the city and to the community around. We also work very closely with different organizations, a civic organization in the city, and today I'd like to recognize 4 of them. They've been great partners: the Young Latino Network, Global Cleveland, the U.S. Commercial Service Cleveland, and International Business Network of Northeast Ohio. Thank you again for your partnership and commitment to the community. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our President and Ambassador in Residence, Heather Hodges, and she will be introducing the speaker.
Well, good evening, everyone, and very glad to see so many people here interested in Cuba. It's a real honor to be introducing Ted Piccone of the Brookings Institution. I'll get to the timeliness of this in a second, but first I want to say that we couldn't be more fortunate in having a person talk to us about Cuba who is so informed, who is so rational, who is, has followed Cuba for many years, and also issues of democracy and human rights, and is really recognized as an authority on Cuba. So it is, I'm very glad that he was able to come. Ted has followed Cuba in and out of the U.S. government, and in particular was in the U.S. government during the Clinton administration. He was with the National Security Council and with the Department of State, which is where I met him. And he was co-founder of and executive director of the Democracy Coalition Project, an organization working to promote international human rights and democracy. He's been with the Brookings Institution since 2008 as deputy director for the Foreign Policy Program, and as vice president and director from 2013 to 2014. But as I was saying, tonight's the perfect example of the expression, timing is everything, right? I first talked or approached Ted maybe in September, October, to come and speak to us in December. And, you know, we talked about it, and then finally he said, well, you know, I'm going to Cuba in December. Maybe we should do this in January, because then I will come having seen a little bit more, and I'll have a little fresher information. So that's one point in which the timing was, you know, really very good. Also, I was director of Cuban affairs from 1991 to 1993, which seems like a long time ago, but between those dates and last December, not much had changed. And I always knew that if there was going to be a change in Cuba policy, the timing had to be absolutely perfect. And preferably it had to come at a time when a president was leaving his term and could go out and take the risk of changing the policy. Previous presidents did not take advantage of that, but now we know that President Obama and President Castro of Cuba made their announcements December 17, and as I say, the timing was just right. It couldn't have been done probably earlier, would have been very difficult, and even a little bit later, and certainly not to leave it to a successor, right? So that's another timing issue. Right. And then, of all things, Ted's timing was really good, because he was in Cuba the day that these announcements were made. Right. So we're looking forward to hearing from Ted talking about Cuba in general, but also maybe telling us a little bit of what it was like to be there on that day. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor for me to be here. I'm just going to open up my iPad here so we can get going. I want to thank, in particular, Ambassador Heather Hodges for your 3 decades of public service. I also want to thank very much Ron Richards of the Cleveland Foundation. He was, in the Cleveland Foundation, a very early supporter of the Brookings Institution's work on Cuba back in 2008. And really laid a project that we think laid the intellectual and political foundation for the historic opening to Cuba that we're witnessing today. So thank you for that. And I'm honored to be in Cleveland for the first time, which is the hometown of my boss, Strobe Talbot, whom you honored recently for his remarkable public service career. Tonight's topic on Cuba, as Heather said, could not be more timely. The joint announcements by Presidents Obama and Raul Castro on December 17th, and the events since then, have closed the chapter on the 5-decade-long history of conflict between our two countries, and opened a new chapter, which remains to be written, but whose main features I will try to outline tonight. but it is no doubt a real moment of history and hope, I think, for both sides in our two countries. So I want to discuss this unfolding rapprochement with Cuba and its implications for the United States by asking ourselves 4 questions. Why now? So I'll say more about the timing issue. How was it done? That's particularly important. What does it mean, and what's next? So starting with why now, let's start on the U.S. side. President Obama has just lost any party control in the Congress after elections that were in many ways a referendum on his last 2 years in office. But you wouldn't know that from his actions since then. Across a number of issues, immigration reform, his very bold State of the Union speech on initiatives to support the middle class, and on Cuba, President Obama has seized the initiative and signaled his intention to govern with his legacy in mind, with or without Congress. President Obama, even before arriving at the White House in 2009, was clear about his frustration with longstanding U.S. policy towards Cuba and the way the embargo had failed to achieve its aims. In 2009, he decided to restore the Clinton-era measures to facilitate some limited trade and travel to Cuba. These steps were the critical foundation for the policy he announced on December 17th. And let me explain. By making it easier for Cuban Americans to visit their families and send them unlimited remittances, he opened a door to dialogue and reconciliation within the Cuban community, which has been separated by conflict and bitterness for so many years. Since the changes were enacted in 2009, Cuban Americans have sent over $6 billion in cash and goods to their relatives. These remittances provide a lifeline to Cuban people struggling with the hardships of the Cuban economy and gave them the capital to open small businesses, restaurants, B&Bs, a number of different categories of economic activity that the government is now allowing. The process of reconciliation fostered by Obama's first-term measures also had the effect of, I believe, breaking the dominant hold of the traditional group of anti-Castro regime change forces that have controlled the debate on U.S. Cuba relations for the last 2 decades. Public opinion polls in Florida and in Miami specifically have cataloged the steady erosion of support for the embargo within the Cuban American community and a willingness to move toward engagement with Havana. So the third rail of Florida politics has been effectively neutered, a trend that I think will only accelerate as younger Cuban Americans settle down and register to vote. On the Cuban side, it's important to recognize the ongoing series of economic reforms that Raul Castro initiated in 2008. It would take a while to go through all of them, but in essence, these reforms are designed to create a mixed economy, more open to a globalized world, and to foreign investment. They've given Cubans the ability to open small businesses. Roughly 500,000 are employed in these small businesses. Establish cooperatives, support farmers. Cubans are now allowed to buy and sell property. Most Cubans own their own homes, to own cell phones, and to travel off the island, which had been very difficult in previous years. Ironically, easier for Cubans to leave the island than for Americans to visit Cuba. A key motive for these economic changes was to reduce Cuba's reliance on Venezuela as a source of subsidized oil and tap into other potential sources of foreign investment. Hugo Chavez's close relationship with Fidel Castro was no longer relevant, as both men left the scene, giving Fidel's younger brother, 82-year-old Raul Castro, the space needed to prepare Cuba for a future without the Castros. In other words, to move from the arbitrary, personalistic control of Fidel Castro to a more institutionalized, inclusive, but still Communist Party-controlled state. To succeed, Raul Castro needed the United States to reduce its punitive sanctions on the Cuban economy, which was having a direct effect on Cuba's ability to function in the international economy, particularly in the financial arena. It should be noted in particular that Cuba's placement on the U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism list since 1982 has had real painful effect on Cuba's ability to conduct basic financial transactions. And I would say in the last several years, the Obama administration's Treasury Department has been very aggressive about enforcing those sanctions and has caught up a lot of, in particular, European banks and punished them for doing any kind of dollar-based transactions with Cuba, kind of caught up in the tightened sanctions against Iran and other countries. To this day, the Cuban mission in Washington cannot even find a U.S. bank to take its business. In addition, Cuba needs to build up its hard currency reserves in order to end its highly distortionary dual currency system. This system rewards those who work in the tourist economy, who are paid in convertible pesos, at the expense of state workers who are paid in the old pesos, a meager wage that is very hard to live on, even with a highly subsidized social safety net. And this is where the remittances from family in the United States comes in really in important ways. The average Cuban worker, state worker, earns about $20 a month. So the timing was right. After congressional elections and before the presidential campaigns got underway on our side, and while Raul Castro had the authority to carry out these reforms for the two sides to move ahead. How is it done? I have to admit that all of us who follow Cuba closely were very surprised by the breadth and the drama of the announcements on December 17th. On that day, many of us were gathered in Havana at a conference on U.S. Cuban relations. This was in conjunction with the foreign ministry, and so it was an elite group of academics and diplomats, all predicting what was going to happen in 2015. And we knew something was likely to happen by the end of the year, but no one predicted the boldness of the package announced that day. And just to review a couple of the highlights, an exchange of long-sought imprisoned spies. For the Cubans, this was a major victory. You know, the 5 heroes are plastered in billboards all over Cuba, and there were 3 still in U.S. prisons. So they returned home. And of course, one of our spies was returned home as well. In addition, the return of a USAID contractor, Alan Gross, to celebrate Hanukkah with his family. The timing, again, was really remarkable. I should also say that the announcement was made on the day of San Lázaro, the feast day of St. Lazarus, who in Cuba is considered a very revered figure, both for the Catholic and the Afro-Cuban Santeria community. And when I was with this group of Cubans, the number of them were just in tears of joy and saying it was the miracle of San Lázaro, the same day as the patron saint's holiday. The agreement, Obama also announced, the 2 of them, to begin a process of normalizing relations. It will not happen overnight. And then the unilateral steps that President Obama announced to liberalize trade, travel, telecommunications with the island. It would probably take me too long, and I'm already probably going too long, to dissect all the elements that led to the result, but let me mention a few. First, the role of the Catholic Church in Cuba, which has over time had more authority and flexibility to serve its mission. And this goes back to Pope John Paul and then Pope Benedict visiting, very important. And then the Catholic Church in the United States, which together teamed up to involve Pope Francis, the first Latin American Pope, in direct engagement with President Obama. So they met and spoke about this and intervened a second time to plead for the release of the prisoners. So this engagement was instrumental, and I think bodes well for the future role of the church in Cuban society. Second, the fact that the talks happened in secret. They were hosted by Canada for 18 months and were actually kept secret right until the very last minute. This is truly remarkable to me in this day of social media that they were able to do that. And unfortunately, they upset a lot of people who were so caught by surprise, including Cuban American members of Congress and some of the dissident community who felt betrayed by not being informed by this. But in my view, it was really the only way they could do it. It was such a politicized, polarized environment. And the fact that they were able to pull it off in such fashion shows the value of some secrecy in diplomatic negotiations. Third, there's shifting opinions, as I mentioned before, not only within the Cuban American community, but more broadly among a coalition of business groups. Chamber of Commerce, Google CEO Eric Schmidt visited, the agricultural community, the human rights community, which thought the embargo was very counterproductive to promoting human rights on the island. Religious groups, diplomats, the media. There was a heavy series of coverage in the New York Times. All these groups came together arguing why a change in policy was long overdue. And I think this gave the White House, which is generally speaking cautious, the courage they needed to move ahead, even in the face of what they knew would be very hostile reactions from some members of Congress. So my third question is, what does all this mean? By turning the page so dramatically, by doing the big enchilada, President Obama has effectively declared an end to the Cold War in Latin America. The language he used to describe the embargo as a failure and the importance of finding other ways to empower the Cuban people, I think was the right formula to make this transition from what has been a punitive regime change policy to one of constructive but critical engagement. And this was, in fact, the theme of our first Brookings study that was supported by the Cleveland Foundation. And if you look at what we produced then and what we have now, there is a great similarity, and we're very proud of that. While only Congress, as we know, can lift the embargo is codified because of the shoot down of planes in 1996. President Obama, in record time for the US bureaucracy, issued regulations just this month that punch new holes in the embargo, creating, I think, a whole new dynamic that will erode its effect and hollow it out and eventually lead to its, not collapse, but dramatically changed set of sanctions. More broadly, I think it's the end of the era of big comprehensive sanctions in US foreign policy in favor of much more targeted sanctions that punish a country's leaders or criminal groups, like what we have in place in Iran or North Korea. What else does it mean? I think the policy change also breathes new life in US relations with Latin America. This was a key factor in the timing as well. The Summit of the Americas, which is a meeting of all the heads of state of the region, will take place this April in Panama. And the rest of the region told the United States, we're not going to come unless Cuba is invited. And the US didn't want to exclude itself from this important meeting that the US initiated back in the Clinton administration. So now we'll have President Obama and likely President Raul Castro there. It may just be a photo op, but I think that in and of itself is another moment of symbolic change. And it also allows us to move on to other issues on the hemispheric agenda. There's hope that our Latin American neighbors will also work with us to bring Cuba further along and to integrate them into the region, and to do so in accordance with the region's standards on democracy and transparency and human rights. We'll see, but that is one of the propositions to be tested in the coming months. Referring back to the Cuban American community, it may be the beginning of the end of the hardliner point of view. I think the next several months will tell us if they have the muscle to roll back President Obama's changes. If they get a bill to the president's desk, I expect he will veto it, just given how high profile this issue has become in his State of the Union speech especially. I think all the signals I've seen in Washington are that there will be debate, there'll be hearings, there'll be oversight, but not enough consensus to actually overturn these initial steps. Both parties are actually divided on this, but particularly the Republicans. There is some movement to see the travel ban lifted legislatively. Right now, you may not go as a tourist to Cuba under US law. There are some bills likely to be introduced on that subject, but again, I don't think there'll be action. And then I think there's also some meaning, since this is something I work on around the world, democracy promotion strategy. I think it's really going to put us to the test on how to do this differently, and to shift from an imposed regime change strategy to something that looks much more like a soft landing, that the ultimate goal is to see a more stable, prosperous, open, democratic Cuba. What we've tried the last 50 years hasn't worked, clearly, so it's time to try something else. That is the U.S. end goal. Cubans don't see it the same way, but I think there is a moment and a dynamic of change that is possible to empower the Cuban people and help them become more independent of the Cuban state. And that's already happening with the economic changes that I referred to. At the end of the day, it's up to the Cuban people to decide where to go from here. But at least the U.S. embargo will no longer act as an excuse for the Cuban government's own failings. Finally, what's next? So as I mentioned, the regulations are out in record time, in force. It allows for 12 categories of U.S. travelers to go to Cuba on a general license. So you no longer have to apply to the Treasury Department to get a special license. You can just go with an affirmation that I'm going for this purpose. And it has to be one of these 12 purposes: humanitarian, educational, cultural, journalism, etc. Be much, much easier to do it. And having been denied a license when Brookings first went down as an institution to visit, we were told we couldn't go because we didn't meet all the requirements. The second time we gave them more information, they said, you can go, but you can't go to a baseball game. This was a people-to-people license, which is really strange to imagine that a baseball game would be a problem. But I guess someone thought it was too touristy. But this was the problem. The regulations were so narrowly enforced that it really provided great confusion and complexity and cost. Airlines will probably begin to schedule regular service, although they do need a civil aviation agreement between the two sides, so that's something that will be negotiated. The regulations allow easier trade in certain permitted categories: agriculture, construction materials. That is a relatively new category, which I think will provide opportunities for some U.S. companies. Cubans need a lot of paint in particular. If you've been to Cuba, you know that what you see, and they need a lot of help. Telecommunications. This is a particularly important area for our democracy strategy, not just for business. To open Cuba to the rest of the world, to help them connect to each other. And right now, internet penetration in Cuba is only between 5 and 15%. On that higher end range includes people who just have access to the domestic intranet system, which is controlled. So it's very low, even by world standards, and a lot of opportunity there. I think you'll also start to see bilateral cooperation agreements in areas of mutual interest. This includes direct mail. We don't even have direct mail service with Cuba. This is how low the starting point is really low. We're talking about counter-narcotics cooperation, marine safety, environmental issues. We're going to talk with Mexico, Cuba, and the United States on Gulf of Mexico boundary limitations, practical things. Diplomatic relations is another next big step, and the negotiations that began last week with our State Department delegation, this was a key topic. I think this will happen relatively quickly. Upgrading of our 2 embassies, the ability of our diplomats to travel around the country. Our chief of mission will now be called the chief of mission and ambassador, although there's a whole question about nominating and Senate confirmation that I can get into if you'd like. The regulations also provide direct support from Americans, any American, to the private sector in Cuba. What it's called in Spanish, cuentapropistas, people who are opening their own small private businesses. Before it was quite restricted, including imports from Cuban small businesses to the United States. Those rules are still being written, but I think this is really a great opportunity to carry out this vision of empowering Cuban people and helping them be more independent and creating some kind of middle class in Cuba that will eventually, I think, change the political economy of the country. Human rights. So, of course, the United States put that on the table for talks last week. The Cuban diplomats said, well, no, we didn't really talk about it. This, of course, is central to the U.S. Policy. And look, here as I see the facts, looking at Cuba in relationship to other parts of the world as well, Cuba has a mixed record. It's not all horrible on economic and social rights, which we don't talk about much in this country, but the rest of the world does think of economic and social rights when they think about human rights. Cuba does well. It prides itself on high quality education and healthcare systems, high literacy rates, low maternal and infant mortality rates. They do very well for their peers. And although I have to say some of these systems are under increasing pressure due to budget cuts and the defections to the tourist economy for other reasons. But yes, on political and civil rights, Cuba is a closed system that permits no freedom of expression or association or freedom of the media. Even finding the state newspaper is hard in Cuba. It's really quite sad. Little respect for due process or the rule of law. There is, however, internal debate within the limits of the one-party system, and it is growing, and it's hard for us to see as outsiders, but it is happening. And Raul Castro actually encourages it. He wants and invites criticism of the system. There are more and more letters in the state newspaper complaining about what's wrong with the Cuban system. The Catholic Church has catalyzed a lot of this debate. I attended a public debate that anyone could go to on the Cuban budget process that was broadcast on the internet. There are things happening in Cuban society. There are certain red lines that you can't cross, but civil society is more diverse than it looks. It's not just a small group of dissidents. This is what we hear mostly in the United States. There's a very divided opinion within the dissident community, but there are many others. There are groups of Afro-Cubans who are defending their rights, LGBT groups, there are now gay pride parades, there are artists, there are women's groups, environmental groups that are beginning to form their own networks of interest. The academics that we've worked with at the University of Havana are some of the more outspoken actors, I would say, in critiquing the Cuban economy. And they're able to do that in the system, and that's important. We have to listen to those folks. So finally, just 2 points. What happens to Fidel? So Fidel Castro is pretty much out of the scene, but he still has a regular column in Granma, the daily newspaper, and he has one yesterday's paper, today, I'm not sure exactly when it came out, in which he effectively endorses the negotiations with the United States. And this is very important in the Cuban political dynamic because it gives Raul Castro an answer to the hardliners, the Fidelistas in the system who don't want to see negotiations or change with the United States, are very much opposed to it. And it says, I'm okay with this. Now, of course, there's lots of other language there about remaining true to the revolutionary ideals. He does talk about human dignity in an interesting way. So I think, biologically, Fidel will leave the scene at some point. I think he's largely already sidelined, but at that moment, I don't expect a great change. I think it'll be recognized for as a historical figure, but Raul is very much in charge. What happens after our elections in 2016? There's quite a bit of concern about that because what President Obama has done can be overturned overnight with a new president. And some of the Republican candidates have already said that they would probably do that. They've told, at least in Florida, the Cuban-American community that they oppose these changes. And so that'll be interesting to watch what happens. The final point is Raul Castro will leave. He has said, at least, that he will depart the scene in 2018. So there is already a process of change going on in Cuba in which a younger generation is being groomed to lead the country in, I think, a much more of a collective decision-making process and more technocratic and more inclusive, but they will still certainly try to control both the economy and the politics. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that evolves, but it's important for the United States to be engaged in that process of change and to get to know who those next leaders are going to be and to look ahead to the post-Castro era. Thank you very much.